So this is the beginning of chapter 2, starting on page 6. And Sallust begins with igitur, meaning therefore, and then initio. Now, initium is a second declension neuter noun meaning beginning. And here we have ablative for time when. So therefore, in the beginning, and then the subject is kings, reges. And then we get a statement in parentheses, kind of like if it were in brackets. And then he explains, he says, for nam, introducing an explanation. That was id fuit, the first name, primum nomen, of power, imperi, in the land, in terris. In other words, monarchy was the original form of government on earth. That's his claim. Or maybe by in terris he means in Italy, but that seems to be the idea that kingship was the original form of government. And he then says about the kings that pars, literally part of them, some of them, exercebant ingenium, exercised their intellect, but others, alii, exercised their body, corpus. And then we also have this word divorci. Now this is a kind of archaic spelling that you get in Sallust sometimes. In other authors it would probably be diversi with an E. So diversi means differently or contrastingly. So the point is, different kings did different things. Now, another thing that's just worth mentioning here is that some Latin authors would use alii twice. So you'd say alii here and alii there. But Sallust instead uses pars in the first half and then alii in the second half. And this is sometimes called variatio. And variatio, there it is a sort of literary device that maintains the reader's attention, keeps them focused by using unbalanced syntax, so using a different word from what you would expect. So he's saying, different kings operated in different ways. And then he says, etiam tum, even then, the vita hominum, the life of men, or the life of human beings, genitive plural, was lived, agitabatur, imperfect passive, without greed, sine cupiditate. So sine plus ablative, meaning without, and therefore cupiditate is the ablative of the noun cupiditas, meaning desire or greed or something like that. So originally people didn't experience greed. But then he says, sua, which is the subject of the next phrase, that means his own things. And it's neuter plural because it means sort of things in general. His own things, his own stuff, his own possessions were pleasing enough, placebant say, for each person, quoique. And this would be spelt in most Latin authors, cuique, C-U-I-Q-U-E. But here it's spelled with a Q, two Qs, because it's part of Sallust's kind of archaic style. So in other words, each person was happy with what he had. He wasn't desiring or coveting other people's possessions. Okay. And then moving on to the next sentence, vera, in truth. And then postea quam is just another way of saying post quam. So after, in Asia Kilus, in Asia Cyrus, and in Graecia Lacedaemonii et Athenienses, in Greece the Lacedaemonians or Spartans, and the Athenians began koi pere. Now that is a form which would be in less archaic Latin, that would be koi perunt. So it's third person plural perfect tense. So after these people began to subdue, subigere, urbis atque nationes, cities and nations. Now, urbis is another rather archaic spelling. In other authors, that would be urbes, like that. Urbis couldn't be any other form, because if it were dative or ablative plural, it would be urbibus. So urbis is an alternative for urbes. So they began to subdue cities and nations, urbis atque nationes. And they also began to do some other things. They began to habere, to have, or metaphorically to consider, their lubidinem, their lust of dominating, right? So dominandi is a genitive of the gerund, the verbal noun, so it means of dominating. In English, in better English, we would say lust for dominating, right? So they began to consider their lust for dominating a causam belli, a cause of war. In other words, they began to think that just because they wanted to control somewhere, that was a good enough reason to invade it. And by the way, that's another archaic spelling, lubidinem, in more contemporary Latin in Sallust's time, that would have been libidinem. Okay, and they also began to do something else. They began to putare, to think, or here we could translate it as to see, not in the literal sense of seeing with your eyes, but in the metaphorical sense of considering something, right? They began to see the maximum gloria, the greatest glory, in maximo imperio, in the greatest empire. In other words, they began to believe that the bigger the empire that you have, the greater glory you have. Right. And then here we have again another old-fashioned Sallustian spelling, right? Maximum instead of maximum, and maximo instead of maximo. Okay. So he's saying, you know, originally people lived without greed, they were happy with what they had, but then the great empires began to emerge, right? Cyrus in the 6th century, in the mid-6th century, who was the founder of the Persian Empire, and then, you know, the Spartans and Athenians in Greece, who started doing some invading. And the idea is that, you know, at this point, people started being greedy. People started wanting other people's possessions, right? They wanted to invade places just because they desired conquest or just because they wanted a bigger empire. Okay, so once all that had happened, tum daemum, only then. Right? Daemum is an adverb meaning only, like tantum, for example, or solum. Right? Then only. Compertum est, was it ascertained? It was discovered, something like that. From danger and experiences, ablatives there, periculo atque negotiis. It was discovered from danger and experiences. And now we go into indirect statement, accusative and infinitive. The accusative is ingenium and the infinitive is posse. So it was ascertained that the intellect is able, posse. And we have to imagine another word like facere, is able to do or to accomplish. Perhaps efficere would be used here, is able to do plurumum, the most, in war, in bello. Okay. So once we had all these aggressive wars, people realized that actually the intellect was more important in war than just brute strength. And there's another kind of archaic spelling here, plurumum. In more contemporary Latin, that would be plurimum with an I in it. Okay, so let's go on then to page 8. And we start with the word quod si, which means but if. It will be like sed si. So but if, and the subject is virtus, the excellence or prowess of mind, animi, of kings and of generals, regum atque imperatorum, those are both genitive, plural. If the excellence of mind of kings and generals were strong, valeret, right? This is the verb valeo, valere, to be strong. And here it's subjunctive because we're in a conditional sentence. If the excellence of mind of kings and generals were strong in peace, in pace, ita ut, as much as in war, in bello, then, and the next subject is res humanae, literally human things, we might say human affairs, would haberent sese, would literally hold themselves, or we might say maintain themselves or work out or something like that. Human affairs would work out. And haberent is subjunctive because again we're still in a conditional sentence. Human affairs would maintain themselves aequabilius atque constantius. Now these are both comparative adverbs. So aequabilius means more evenly, and constantius means more steadily. And then Sallust says neque, which means nor or and not. You would see cerneres, another imperfect subjunctive because we're in a conditional clause, nor would you see that, and now we go into indirect statement, accusative and infinitive. So you've got an accusative here with aliud, and then you've got infinitives, feri, mutari, and misceri. And then another accusative is omnia, right? So nor would you see. Aliud, one thing is carried, ferri, present passive infinitive of ferro, that one thing is carried to one place, alio. And this use of alius implies, one thing is carried to one place, something else is carried somewhere else, right? So nor would you see that one thing is carried to one place, another to another, nor, neque, that everything, omnia, is changed, mutari, another present passive infinitive, and mix up at misceri, another present passive infinitive. So Sallust is basically saying, if kings and generals were as skilled at ruling in peacetime as they are skilled in ruling in wartime, then society would be a much more peaceful and calm and happy place than it is in reality. Okay. And then he says, now, which means for in the sense of introducing an explanation, for power, imperium, is kept or is retained, retienatur, present passive, easily, facile, by those arts, eis artibus, dative case, by which, quibus, it was produced, partum est, perfect passive of the verb pario, which means to produce or beget or create something, by which it was produced in the beginning, initia, ablative time when. Okay. So his point, I think, is that if you can keep, as a ruler, if you can keep the skills with which you gained power in the first place, you will be able to keep it. And the reason that some rulers lose power is because they lose the skills that they had originally, right? They become complacent or lazy. They go soft, if you like, and that's why people lose power, right? So he then says, but verum, when ubi laziness, desidia, has invaded, invasere, pro labore, in place of or instead of labor, and when lubido atque superbia, lust and arrogance, have invaded, let's take invasere again, in place of self-restraint, continentia, and fairness, et equitate, right? When that has happened, then fortuna, fortune, is exchanged or is changed in mutatur, present passive, simul cum moribus, together with the habits. Right? So now a couple of linguistic points. One is that invasere, this is an archaic form of invaserunt. So it's third person plural perfect. And it's third person plural because it has multiple subjects. Desidia, lubida, and superbia. And then we have again another old-fashioned Sallustian spelling. This would be libido in other contemporary writers. So Sallust's basic point here is, as a ruler, when you obtain power in the first place, you do it through labor, through self-restraint, and through fairness. But if you start to go bad as a ruler, right, if you start to be lazy, lustful, arrogant, right, that's when your fortune will change. Right? That's when you will lose power. Right? When your mores change, your habits, right, then your fortune will change as well. Okay. And then finally on this page he says, ita, so power, imperium, semper transfertur, is always being transferred, present passive, ad optimum quemque, to each best man, or in more natural English, to all the best men, a minus bono, from the less good. And if you notice, we've got another old-fashioned spelling here, optimum instead of optimum. Okay.